Yeah, today I'm here with Les Jones, the Conservative candidate for the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'm talking to him as part of my project called Safe on the Streets, which is all about investigating street harassment. So the first thing that I really want to ask you is, are there any existing laws against harassment in the street, or is there anything that we can report to the police if we do face an incident like that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the existing law is concerned, I think if you feel threatened, it's perfectly reasonable to report it to the police. The difficulty is, of course, being able to get a police officer to attend quickly in that situation, because it's very volatile. It can happen very suddenly without any warning. One of the things I'm trying to look for actually into the future is having a mobile phone app where you can report incidents instantly to the police rather than having to pick up the phone, because that itself can add to the threat if people think you're calling the police. Whereas with a mobile phone app, you could be just sending a text to someone. And then you can actually feel reasonably confident because they can tell you almost instantaneously how long it'll take to come out to you. But yes, you can report threats. What action is taken after that would depend on how the police officer perceives that threat when he arrives.
Okay. So I think the idea of the app sounds quite good, because that's a safe response without the perpetrator necessarily knowing what
Absolutely, that's why it seems to me like a good idea. And so many people, not just young people, so many people now carry smartphones, it would be easy to do.
Okay. So this kind of, moving on from that, but can the police actually intervene in those kind of situations? In the first place, like, is it all right for the police to step in and say something? Or I
think if a police officer was present, or even a PCSO, if they perceived that you were feeling threatened, I don't think it would be unreasonable for them to intervene. They don't need to exercise the law. Any decent human being in that situation would do the same. Of course, there is always a threat, because we don't know whether the person is going to be carrying a weapon. So it would be better if it's a police officer. But I, as an individual, would intervene if I thought you were being threatened, or felt threatened, actually, because it's not always the real threat, it's the perceived threat that makes you feel uncomfortable about being alone.
Because I was in Birmingham the other day, just by where the Bull is, and there were two men trying to basically get the phone numbers of two women that were sitting down, but they were clearly feeling uncomfortable, and they kept just saying, "Could you leave us alone?" And they carried on. They were shouting across at them, so everybody around could hear. Nobody stepped in. I personally didn't step in because I was a young woman like those women, and I didn't think that. I thought that was just going to make the situation worse. You would have just drawn attention to yourself. But there were two police officers standing nearby, and that's why I asked that question, because they didn't do anything. And I'm not sure whether they just didn't hear, or whether... I didn't know whether they literally couldn't. So yeah, that's why I wanted to...
Yeah, I mean, it is a matter of judgment, and I think it's important that police officers do exercise judgment, because it could be that they saw that there was a possible problem, but decided to stand back until it became a problem, and then they would have intervened, I'm sure. I have no doubt they would have done that. But sometimes it is better to let these things cool themselves down. The presence of the police officers, I hope, gave reassurance to those women that they were safe.
Yeah. I think also that sometimes it's very difficult to actually judge if you saw a man talking to a woman, you don't necessarily know if that's just a man that she knows, or if they're actually having a conversation and it's friendly. You can't always tell, can you, as an outsider, whether they're kind of arguing or whether it's just a friendly conversation.
And to be fair, even if they are arguing, if it's a couple and they're together, there's no reason to intervene unless it becomes nasty.
Yeah, unless it starts affecting other people.
I could give an example actually of something that happened to me once, leaving an election count late at night. I had to walk through a subway, and there were a group of youngish people, quite young people, standing at the far end of that tunnel, and they were apparently drinking. They were swinging from bottles, and they were making quite a lot of noise, and I was alone, and I'm a fairly well-built black bloke, I can look after myself, but I felt quite threatened. But I felt that there were two options. I could either walk in the opposite direction, in which case if there was a problem they could chase me and they would win, and much quicker than me, or I could face them and walk into that group, and I chose to do the latter. When I got there, I simply announced that I was coming by saying, "Hi lads, you know, how's it going?" And they were fine. but the perceived threat was still there. You know, you still felt uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If that was a woman, I would imagine that that would be quite scary, or another young person who didn't know the group.
Yeah.
So I can understand the fear that can come just from those encounters.
Yeah. What advice would you actually give to women and young girls if they're in a situation and they are being street harassed, or if they've had it happen repeatedly and they want to do something about it?
Well, if it's happened, it depends what the circumstances are, what they can do about it. Because, of course, as you said, if you report that to the police after the event, there's very little chance of them actually finding the perpetrator, let alone doing anything about it. If it's serious and it does involve any kind of assault, and I'm not talking about serious, but just grabbing somebody is an assault.
Yeah.
Then I would report it to the police, because it could show a pattern. It may be that that person has done it before, and if people don't report it, then there's always a risk that they'll keep getting away with it until it becomes something more serious. If at the time it's happening, it's hard to give advice, because I think it's something you have to use your judgment with. If you talk to them politely and say you're really not very comfortable with what's going on, would you mind just leaving me alone and walk away? I think that's the best thing you can do. I have seen elderly people sometimes start wielding a stick and shouting aggressively out of fear, but that actually makes things worse. So the best advice I can give is, if there's no one around to support you, then try to keep the situation as calm as possible. If there is someone around, draw their attention, whether that be by calling to them, excuse me, or something along those lines, just to make sure they're looking in your direction. They may not intervene, but at least there's a chance that the others will think twice before coming any closer if there are other people around.
Yeah, and I think you'll feel safer knowing that somebody else knows what's actually going on.
That's right.
Like you said, it's difficult to perceive what's actually happening.
Absolutely. You can have a situation where you think you're surrounded by people, but if none of them are looking in your direction, you're no safer than if they're not there. Just draw attention by maybe calling to them, excuse me, could you help me for a moment, or something like that, you know.
Yeah,
a simple thing like that.
That's good, because it's still a proactive solution, because I've found personally that if I ignore it, people will just carry on because they're not necessarily actually aware of the fact that they're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was walking down the road and a man started shouting to me from across the road, and I just carried on walking because I didn't want to make a scene, and I actually had a bus to catch, so I was just running. But he carried on, because he couldn't actually see my face, I didn't think he actually realised how threatened and uncomfortable I actually felt in the first place. So I think it's a good idea to kind of talk, but talk calmly. I
think that's exactly the right thing to do. The whole thing of a situation like that is you don't want to inadvertently make it worse for yourself. So the answer is to be as calm as you reasonably can. And I know it's not difficult in that situation. Your heart starts pounding, the butterflies start, and you feel very uncomfortable. But I think it is important to keep the whole situation calm. If you ever see a police officer going into a volatile situation, you will find that they always do that. They're very polite, very calm, and they speak nicely. They don't go in there saying, come on you, I'm going to sort you out, because that would only escalate the problem. So that's the best advice. The thing to be wary of is, if it happens to you a lot, then it is important maybe to look at where you go alone. And I know that's a terrible thing to say, but at the end of the day, you can only be safe if you feel safe. You can only be safe if you feel safe. And you know, it's something I think you need to be wary of. It seems a shame, because I don't think this is a new problem.
No, not
I think it's always been there. It's just that in this day and age, there is a greater threat, because you don't know what is driving the other person. There may be a drugs issue, there may be an alcohol issue, they may be armed. A few years ago it would have been just shouting and making a noise, and most people would have intervened if there had been a problem. Nowadays I'm afraid there is far too much willingness to walk away, not because they don't care, but because they're fearful for themselves too.
I agree that you need to kind of make sure you're putting yourself into safe spaces, and not kind of putting yourself into potentially dangerous situations knowing that it's going to be dangerous. But I would also say that kind of it's very easy to just get harassed in the daytime when you're making your way to work or school. And I think that's what's an issue for me, because I've had it happen on like public transport and stuff like that when you're in an enclosed space, and really you need you're obviously on the bus or whatever because you need to go somewhere, and that's what I find quite difficult.
Yeah. I understand that, and it is a difficult area. The only advice, again, I could give with that is, if you see somebody on the bus that you consider to be a safe person, maybe an older woman, and you can go and sit by them. It's sometimes a bit strange to do that because you feel like you're invading somebody's personal space, but I don't think that would be a concern to them if they realise that there's maybe a problem for you anyway. But if you sat next to them, you have that confidence of knowing at least there's someone close, and it's far less likely that, unless they were determined bad people with a criminal view, I don't think you're as likely to be approached if that happened.
And I think it sends a clear message that you don't want to be there without kind of insulting them directly.
That's right. You don't need to approach them at all. It's a shame that you can't speak your mind. I mean, I was going to say to you that what I've just described about keeping yourself safe is almost like the argument with, and I'm sorry, it's a much more serious subject, but with rape, saying, you know, women can make sure that they don't become... I'm not suggesting that at all, because it isn't true. People should be free to do as they please, but your own personal common sense will tell you what the limits to that are, and you should always work within those. Always make sure that you feel comfortable. You can't plan for what might happen, but at least you can make sure you don't go into situations that you really won't be comfortable in.
Yeah, I don't think you can necessarily stop someone kind of from harassing you with advanced planning. Like you said, like in cases of rape, when people say, oh, do this, do that, obviously the focus should be on the people who do rape rather
than the victim. But it is common sense for people to take
at the same time,
reasonable precautions.
There's no point in putting yourself in a situation where you know you're going to feel uncomfortable.
That's right. And that was all I was trying to say, really. I don't think you should ever inhibit people from doing what they want to do. But you do have to be concerned for that.
Yeah, that's understandable. So, as a PCC candidate, what are you going to do to ensure that women feel safe in the streets? I'm saying women, and obviously it does happen to men, but I'm saying women because
I think it's primarily an issue for women, yes, and I think that's fair to say, and particularly young women. Older women do have a habit of being more expressive and having had the experience perhaps all through their lives, perhaps better at understanding how to handle it too. Well, there are two things to this really. One is, I think we have to make sure, and the PCC does have a role in this, make sure that schools educate children to understand the freedom that everybody should have from harassment. And I also believe that people like PCSOs, police officers, being more visible, more present in the streets, will also discourage that kind of behaviour, and I would like to see more of that. There has been a lot of complaint in recent times about the number of police on the streets falling off and their visibility being much lower. A police officer in a car is not as much reassurance as somebody walking down the street with you. And that's what I want to get.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.